Welcome, everyone. Another exciting bad online event. My name is Catherine Dupoulou-Ménager, and I'm the Artistic Director of Bad Sydney. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of country throughout Australia. We recognise their continuing connection to land, to waters, and to culture, and pay our respects to their elders, past and present. I'm talking tonight from Camaragal country, and we'll all be talking from somewhere different. We have a huge treat tonight. We have a star of Australian crime fiction, Dervla McTiernan, sensational Dervla McTiernan, who comes from Ireland, lives in Perth, and her first 3 books are set in Ireland with the lovely detective Cormac Riley. I think I'm certainly half in love with him, Dervla, and I think many people are. And your new book, The Murder Rule, is set in America, and it's a thriller where really nothing is quite as it seems. And there are lots of twists and turns. Now, I'm sure everybody who's watching has read at least one of Dervla's books. And if you haven't read more than one, you have a real treat in store. Now, she's being interviewed tonight by Suzanne Leal. That's kind of hard to know how to describe Suzanne, because she's kind of multi-talented. So she's a novelist. Her latest novel is The Deceptions. She's a lawyer experienced in child protection, criminal law and refugee law, and is a senior member of the New South Wales Civil and Administrative Tribunal. But she's also a regular presenter at literary events, writers' festivals. She's co-presents our Bad All About Crime book club. She's a host of her own book club, the Thursday Book Club, which is a lovely, chatty and relaxed one, connecting readers online. And of course, last but not least, she's on the board of Bad Sydney Crime Writers Festival. So welcome to both of you. Before we start, I just want to thank our sponsors, the City of Sydney and Create New South Wales, without whom nothing would be happening, really. Today we're online, but when we're in person, it's usually at the State Library. So we want to thank the State Library of New South Wales very much indeed. We have a relationship with Booktopia, and we appreciate their support. So jump online when the event is over and get Dervla's book, in fact, Dervla's books and Suzanne's books at Booktopia. Well, I'd like to welcome all the Bad community, including our library and book club and bookshop community. So we have a relationship with libraries across New South Wales, and people join us from all sorts of wonderful places. Now, I'll tell you what we'll be doing tonight. I will shut up very soon. I'll let Suzanne take over. She'll interview Dervla for about 45, 50 minutes, at which point you can ask questions. I'll pop back in at the end to say, wasn't that great? And also say thank you and tell you what we're doing next. So Suzanne, I'll throw over to you right now.
Thank you so much, Catherine. Really lovely to be here, and welcome to everybody on the Bad community and people who may not have joined us before on these Bad online sessions. I'm so delighted to be here in conversation with Dervla McTiernan. Welcome, welcome, welcome back, Dervla.
Thank you for having me, Suzanne. I'm really excited to be here.
I'm excited to see you. You know, I was thinking back, and the last time I saw you was years and years ago, and it was just after the release of your first novel, The Ruin, which people will recognise as being this one. An enormous amount has happened for you since then, Dervla. Here are just a couple of events that have occurred. There have been 2 more Cormac Riley books. You've won the Ned Kelly Award, the Davitt Award, the UK Barry Award. You've just had a biggest Australasian, US and UK deal for 3 more novels. And my question to you to kick things off, Dervla, is this: of all the things that have happened over the last 5 years, which has been the most exciting?
Oh my God. Wow, that's toughy. There are 2 things that jump to mind straight away. The first one is getting the deal in the very beginning, you know, when HarperCollins wanted to publish me, and I found that out. And I had just come back from illness, and I was just back at my day job, sitting at my desk, and we worked in a bank of kind of 3 desks this way, 3 desks this way, and we were a really close team. And the book had gone out on submission, and we'd had a preemptive offer, which we'd turned down. And then we were kind of waiting for these 2 weeks to go by. And then as we got to the end of the 2 weeks, the emails started to come in from my agent at the time telling me, you know, this publisher wants to publish you, or that publisher wants to publish you. And I was able to share all that with the people I'd been working with. And it was that dream moment that you think about when you want to be an author, where it's like, wow, maybe this might happen someday. And it was actually happening. I'll never forget how that felt. It was just a pinch me moment. And, even though I guess bigger things have happened since, the other thing that kind of stands out in my mind is the Adelaide Writers Festival that first year, when I went over and I got to share a stage with Louise Penny. Like, I'd been a fan of Louise Penny's for a long time. She's just an extraordinary writer, but there were 400 or 500 people in the crowd there for Louise, obviously, not me. Nobody knew who I was, but I got to sit on the stage with her, and she was so generous and so lovely and so encouraging. And it was just the most exciting thing. And people were so nice. They came up afterwards and I signed some books, and I just felt like a real author. So those are probably the two memories that really stand out.
It's interesting that you bring up the relationship with another crime writer, and a very well-known one, Louise Penny. It seemed to me, I suppose my capacity as an interviewer and also on the board of the Bad Sydney Crime Writers Festival, that the crime community, or the crime writers community, is a particularly generous and open community. Would you agree with that, or not?
Yes, 100%. I mean, I've had only good experiences with other writers. I mean, just Australian writers, Irish writers, UK writers, US writers, the number of writers who have reached out and been supportive, who would take the time to read your book, talk about it online, or send you a private message of encouragement. I mean, there's no reason for anybody to do any of those things, and yet they do, just out of generosity. So I think it's broader than that, but certainly I hear people saying that it's different in other communities. So maybe it's peculiar to the crime writing community.
Is there a strange juxtaposition that you've got people writing about violent, awful acts with heinous people and gruesome times, who in their day life are actually really nice and generous? Is it
they do say it's because we get it all out in the page, we get it out of our systems, whereas romance writers have to be, much more beautiful and positive on the page. And so maybe they have something left to work out in real life, although honestly it's just humor, really. It's not reality. I don't know. I think we are generally people who love books for the entertainment that they bring people, as well as other things, and we just embrace that. I think as a group, if there's anything that pulls us together, maybe it's that, because crime writing now is so broad and so widely spread that I think there are books of every stripe that fall into that category. So I don't think there's any one thing that we have in common, except perhaps that we all write to entertain first. And so maybe I don't know why that makes people friendlier, but it seems to.
I'm going to show you something that you will recognize. This is your new book, yes. The Murder Rule. As I understand it, it's not out anywhere for another week, or at least another few days. And so it's that pre-release time. How is it for you? Is it a time of nervousness? Is it a time of excitement? How do you feel just on the cusp of a new book coming out?
Oh, right now it's really exciting. Right now it feels really good. This morning I got to do a little interview with Studio 10, and that was the first kind of biggish thing that I did. And now I'm getting to do this with you guys. And it, every day has something on now, because I might be doing a late night podcast with the US or something. There's usually a few things a day. And then the tour kicks off properly next week. I'm doing events in Perth, and then I'll be going to Sydney, and then flying to the US, and then back to the East Coast here, and then to Ireland. So I'll be gone for over 3 weeks with events every day. Like that's a really rare opportunity. Not very many writers get a chance to do that. And, at the very beginning, I was given some really good advice by someone who said, just make sure you enjoy it. Yes, you're nervous and you feel self-conscious and you feel a bit odd, but enjoy the process, because, who says it's going to last, first of all, but secondly, if you enjoy it, then other people will enjoy it more as well. And so I've kind of always had that mentality, and I really do enjoy it. I love doing these events, getting a chance to talk to people and talk about books and meet book people. So right now I mostly feel this like bubble of excitement, combined with terror that I'm going to get COVID in the next 4 or 5 days and the whole thing will fall over. But if that doesn't happen, I'm super excited to get started.
And of course, let's just assume that COVID has done its dash your way, and everything will be fine. Just the possibility of having in-person events, I think from my perspective, you don't realize what you've got until you haven't got it anymore.
Yeah.
And I love being back on stage. I love seeing people in person. I love the festivals. Is this an excitement that you have as well after these last 2 years?
Absolutely. There's something, you cannot beat that feeling of doing something in person. You know, it's just not, there's something about the alchemy of being in the same room with everybody, I think, that really helps. I mean, the joy of being able to do events online is that we get to talk to each other in circumstances where it just couldn't happen otherwise. And we get access to authors that we wouldn't see otherwise. And that's fabulous. I mean, I saw some events over lockdown that I was just so excited that I got to hear from these authors, you know, that I wouldn't, who are in the US or the UK or elsewhere, and there's no way I would hear them otherwise. But there is something lovely as a writer when you go into a room and you go up on stage and you can see people's faces. And I love being able to talk to people afterwards when I'm signing books. That's just a really lovely thing for me. I've always enjoyed that. So I'm excited that I get to do that as well.
Let's turn to the murder rule in a bit more detail. In the murder rule, we meet Hannah Rokeby. Can you just tell me a little bit about Hannah? Who are you meeting at first?
Yeah, Hannah is a young law student, you know, very early 20s. And she's two different people. I guess there's the Hannah that you think you know, and then there's the Hannah that's under the surface. So the Hannah you think you know is exactly what you would expect her to be. She's a young woman who has just joined the Innocence Project at the University of Virginia. So the Innocence Project is, probably a lot of people have heard about it through Barry Scheck and other high-profile lawyers. The Innocence Project is a group of volunteer lawyers, or a group of, you know, there are segmented small groups all around the country who volunteer their time to work to free people who have been unjustly convicted. And so Hannah joins this little offshoot of the Innocence Project at the University of Virginia as a student. And, you know, she appears to be this bright-eyed, idealistic, I want to change the world and I'm really eager to please kind of girl. In reality, she's a very different person. You know, you scrape the surface of Hannah and you find someone who's much darker and more complicated. She's obviously working to her own agenda. You figure that out very quickly. And it takes a little bit more time before you figure out exactly what that agenda is. And at the beginning, she is absolutely convinced that she is right. You know, she knows what she's doing. She has right on her side. And, you know, people who really, really believe they have right on their side, they can be dangerous because they will go, you know, to great lengths. They can be quite ruthless. And certainly Hannah is that person at the beginning of the story.
When you say the person who believes they have right on their side can be dangerous, we've both studied law, you and I, Dervla, and both practiced it for some years. Do you think that's one of the benefits of a legal practice, that you are taught to argue both sides of the case, so that the idea of being right depends on the brief you're given? Do you think that makes a lawyer like yourself more open to ideas or less?
Do you know, I think what it does is it gives you an opportunity to see a little bit behind the public facing picture. And that gives you a little bit of an insight sometimes into the fact that truth is complicated. It's very rarely black and white. It's very rare that one person has everything on their side and nothing wrong with their story or their argument. And certainly, I mean, going into a court case where you're absolutely confident in your case, and then you hear the other side and you realize, oh, hang on, there was some nuance here I wasn't aware of. Or look, I think you definitely learn quickly, but as a young lawyer, there is a tendency to get a bit excited and a bit, you know, right on with your case. And then you can get a little bit too close to it. And that's something you're warned about early on. You know, don't get too close to the client. Don't get too close to the client's point of view, because there is another point of view and you won't necessarily hear it until further down. And it can be quite enlightening to suddenly see it from somebody else's viewpoint. You might not necessarily agree with them entirely, but it does wake you up. So yeah, I would agree with that, Suzanne. I do think it gives you an opportunity to see both sides in a way you might not otherwise.
But of course, when you're dealing with the Innocence Project, it's a popular project and you've got the brightest and the best and the most ambitious of all the students. So I imagine that is often a recipe for a bonfire. Was that something that interests you in terms of how the students interact?
I was fascinated at the idea that these very young people would go out and actually interview witnesses, you know, that they would actually go and do this work themselves when they're so, I mean, I remember, I don't know how you would feel about this, but I remember when I was a very young lawyer, the first time, I wasn't even qualified, I was still a trainee, and I was asked to go to the Master's Court in Dublin just to get a date for cross-examination from the court. I mean, this was the most basic thing in the world. And I was like, what do I do? What do I do? And my training solicitor said, just wait until the very end, until they've called over the whole list. And then you stand up and you just say, excuse me, Master, could I have a date for cross-examination for such and such a case? So the Master's Court in the morning is a bustle of lawyers. You know, every inch of standing space is taken as the Master and his registrar called through the list to check things off. So I waited until the very, very end. The court had completely cleared out, and all that was left standing at the very front was, you know, two counsel who were waiting to speak to the Master about something. They all turned around to stare at me, this idiot still standing at the back of the courtroom. And I went bright red, I mean, almost purple with embarrassment, and said my little thing, got my date, and scurried out. And I remember the fear, you know, and like that was nothing. And then I think about these young people who aren't even qualified, who haven't had any practice or practical experience, going out and meeting with people, meeting with witnesses, talking to family members, trying to build something and take these cases which have already been tried, and there's a huge resistance to reopening them, and build a pathway to freedom. And that is actually what happens, because there are some very big branches of the Innocence Projects, but there are also smaller ones, and there's no one else to do the work. Like, I went to the University of Virginia when I was over in the US for BoucherCon, and tried to get a couple of people from the Innocence Project to talk to me, but they were too busy. So I snuck into the law school, which has no security, by the way. And I went into the canteen where the students eat, and I just kind of talked to people. And I met these two guys who had volunteered for the Innocence Project and who had actually worked various cases. And I had a really good chat with them. And it was so great to hear from them and to hear their thoughts and to hear what they had been doing. But again, I was just struck by how young they were. So, you know, that was fascinating to me, the idea of these young people who are learning on the job and who are taking these extraordinary steps and having such results.
Yeah, it is interesting. I suppose it is a bit sobering to have such responsibility. On the other hand, when you've got a system that isn't funded for this, and this is the last chance for people who proclaim their innocence, that's, I suppose, the inadequacies of the system, perhaps. And I think that's something you also draw out in the
Absolutely. And when you talk about, you know, what being a lawyer gives you, I mean, I was never a criminal lawyer, but even as a civil lawyer and having friends who'd worked in criminal law, that's where you get those little insights that make you realize a lot of the time, you know, we see these very dramatized versions of the stories on television where, you know, there's a corrupt cop or a corrupt DA or something. But a lot of the time it's systemic problems that cause the bigger issues because they're happening again and again. Like this is a case I think I referred to, I think it might have been in The Ruin, or I may have been The Scholar, where a young woman in Galway, this was a real case, was raped and murdered as she crossed a park late at night. And the police knew who it was pretty much straight away, arrested him straight away, and there was physical evidence left on the scene, and they were able to prosecute him, and he went to jail. But that man had already been arrested for rape in that location, and he also left physical evidence which had been sent in a rape kit for processing. Now, if that had been processed early, he would not have been out on bail for that offence, and he would not have been available to commit the second offence. It hadn't been processed because there's a processing delay of 6 to 12 months, I think it was at the time, 18 months for rape kits. That is insane, that a guy is out on bail because the evidence against him in the absence of that kit is weak enough that the judge will grant him bail, whereas if he'd had the processed rape kit, the evidence would have been stronger and the bail application would not have been granted. Those sorts of things you never think about, I think, really, or rarely. I mean, more recently we've had more press about that, but we hadn't historically. And it's that sort of stuff that really niggles at me, you know, these sorts of crazy systemic failures that can impact people's lives so profoundly.
Hannah is not only a law student, she's also quite a devoted daughter of a single mother, and her mother's name is Laura. Tell me a little bit about Laura.
Well, Laura is a bit of a tricky character to pin down. So I'll tell you about Laura at the beginning of the book. I mean, she's not with Hannah. Hannah's gone to the Innocence Project in Virginia, leaving her mother behind, which is something that Laura really struggles with because she's been through some very traumatic experiences in her life. And she has a very loving but bordering on codependent relationship with Hannah. At least that's how everything seems at the beginning of the story. And Hannah is utterly devoted to her mother. And her motivation actually behind a lot of what she's doing is her mother's kind of comfort and safety. And so you see that relationship from a particular point of view at the beginning of the book. And then what I was kind of interested in was sort of trying to increase your discomfort a little bit as a reader with that relationship, to the point where you're kind of questioning it, and then allowing the camera, if you like, to zoom in closer and start to unpick it and start to question, well, is this healthy? Is this right? Is this how things should be between mother and daughter? And then go closer again. And that was sort of what I was trying to do there.
I don't think it's giving anything away to say that that Laura has a drinking problem. And we learned that very quick. And as you've said, I mean, I started to question, what sort of mother has she been? And I suppose what I very early thought, well, pretty neglectful, perhaps she couldn't do any better, but there seemed to be some problems there. Now, the interesting thing for me is it's not the first time that you've written about a mother who has been neglectful. In fact, the Ruin opens with such a scene where we have the death of a woman who's been a pretty inadequate parent. What interests you about this character, the neglectful mother character?
Yeah, it's so interesting that it keeps coming up for some reason. I think with the murder rule, what I was really interested in was a little bit less about neglect and a bit more about this idea of, the duty that we owe our parents. Because, I mean, obviously every culture looks at that differently, and every culture has different standards about, to what degree we owe a duty to our parents. But I'm interested in where that becomes a sort of unhealthy thing. Like, I obviously think that that children owe a duty of respect to their parents, and you would hope that there would be a positive relationship there. But where it kind of seems to tip over into a more toxic situation is where the parent feels that the duty or a sense of connection to the degree that they want to live their lives through their children, or control their children, or have ownership of their children's achievements, or direct their failures and live and die through that. And I guess I'm just fascinated by where that line is. So again, it's like sort of here's a whole spectrum of a relationship, and here's a healthy degree. Now, where does it tip over? And I think it's always those tipping points that interest me, because they are, again, it's a matter of perception, and it's the clouding of that is really interesting to me, because I like to think about, we have all of these perceptions. We come into a situation with preconceived notions, all of us, and biases. And those biases kind of feed how we react to situations. And often we're wrong. Our first take is often wrong. We're bringing our own personal experience to something. We maybe see something in a positive light because it was that way for us. And then it's not necessarily correct. And I think I was playing with that in the wrong one as well, where you have certain perceptions of the narrator of that story at the beginning. And are they right or are they wrong, And I think that interests me. I just want to play with that idea of bias. So for me, it was about, okay, here's a situation where we have a loving relationship between a mother and daughter, we think. A mother who is vulnerable, a daughter who owes a duty of care to her mother, we think. Now let's look closer. So I think that's where the interest for me lay.
Let's turn back to the Innocence Project, but rather than talk about it generally, let's talk about it within the context of the murder rule. So where are we, and who is the group in the Innocence Project in the murder rule?
Okay, so Hannah arrives a little bit late to the Innocence Project in the University of Virginia. The team was put together the previous year, and they kind of know each other. And really, she sort of cons her way onto the team, to be honest with you, which is led by this incredibly charismatic, handsome man called Robert Parekh. And he is this high-profile lawyer. He has quite a public profile himself, and he's leading this team. They're trying to free a man called Michael Dandridge from prison, who they believe to be innocent. In fact, whose clemency hearing has already been heard, and he's been found to be innocent, but he still hasn't been released from prison because the original DA wants to retry and recharge him, and he's being held pending that, which is a bizarre situation, but actually does mirror a case I had read about. There are also two other young students who are in the project, and they've been there for quite some time, and they are working away on this case. So they're very, very bright. You know, these students are the best of the best. To get into a university like the University of Virginia, to get into that law school, you have to be exceptional. It is incredibly competitive. So you have these young people who are used to kind of competing with themselves and with their peers to get these excellent grades. They're motivated enough to take on these projects and to try to do the right thing, but what are they motivated by? And again, Hannah comes in with all these preconceived notions and perceptions and biases about that, and then we see whether she's right or wrong.
As you've said, Michael Dandridge is the man that the team is representing, and as you've also said, he's being retried, and I don't think it gives anything away to say that it's a sexual assault and a murder that he's been convicted of, and then he's being retried for that. My question to you is this. Look, I didn't find him a particularly pleasant or grateful client, but he might well be innocent of the crime. Did you deliberately make him unattractive?
Yes.
Or do you love him?
No, I don't like him very much. I think he's not a good person, you know, and I think I wanted to look at that a little bit too, because the reality is sometimes innocent people are not particularly attractive. You know, sometimes they're not particularly likable. They have complicated histories and backgrounds. That doesn't mean they belong in prison. You know, it's not always easy as a lawyer to deal with your clients. They're not always pleasant people. They won't always be grateful, but that doesn't mean that they don't deserve representation. And so he was always going to be a complicated character because of the background and because of the backstory. And he was formed because of the history. And it's really tricky to say more without giving important things away that I won't do that. I don't want to spoil it for you guys. But yeah, he was by necessity always going to be that kind of person. And it felt right to me anyway. You know, as a writer, you're making 1,000 decisions when you write a book, as you know very well, Suzanne. And each one has an impact on other parts of the story. There was a point where I thought I might take him another direction, but it didn't feel right in the end. So he stayed the delightful person that he is.
Oh, interesting. Having said that, I didn't find Hannah particularly attractive either. Is that just me, or was that you? What do you think?
I think that's so interesting. And you're not the first person to say that, but I find it fascinating because to me, she's a little bit of wish fulfillment for me, because when I was a young lawyer, I was very much, you know, I want to play by the rules. I want to do the right thing. I want to make sure everybody's happy around me. I'm going to be careful. And I think it was a little bit to do with being a product of, you know, a young woman in her early 20s in Ireland at the time. Every meeting I went to was men who were 20, 30 years older than me, because I was doing commercial law. I was working, end up working in, you know, with companies in crisis or companies who were doing big transactions, which means it was the senior leadership team you were dealing with, and they were mostly men. And I was a young woman, and there was an expectation of a certain kind of interaction between us. You know, you just weren't encouraged to be terribly direct. You had to find a way to communicate your thing and do your job well without upsetting anybody. And it was a tricky kind of world to navigate. And I was overly careful, and it took me a long time to grow out of that and to realize that it's very difficult to be brave if you're spending all your time thinking about what other people think of you. And it's very difficult to figure out what you want to do and what you want to be if you're concerned all the time with other people's views. And Hannah really doesn't think about anybody else's view. My God, she thinks she's right, and she thinks she knows what she's doing, and she's just going to do it. Now, she may not be right about that. And she is abrasive, and she isn't terribly likable in the beginning, but I wanted her to be a good person underneath it all. There is a reason that she is the person she is at the beginning. Like, she's been formed by her life experience. And I see the murder rule, what happens in the murder rule is life-changing for her. She's stepping outside of her mother's influence. She's experiencing the world as it really is, as opposed to the way she thinks it is. And she changes, for me anyway, dramatically in the course of that book. She's at the end of that story, she's a different person, and she's raw, and she's starting again, and remains to be seen who she becomes from there. But I see that as her starting point, really, in a weird kind of a way. The end of the book is her new beginning.
Can I just pick that up in case we get an exclusive? New beginning. Is that the new beginning of a book?
No,
Or the new beginning of a character?
not at the moment. The next book I'm writing is something totally different, but I'd be tempted to go back. I feel like there's a lot to work with there, but I haven't any immediate plans.
You heard it here first. Can you tell me what inspired you to write The Murder Rule? Was there a particular case? Was there a particular thought?
Well, it was a newspaper article I read a few years ago about a young Irish law student who went to the States. Have I already told you this? I don't want to repeat myself because I'm so mad at this stage. I can't remember if I've already said it. But she was a young Irish law student. Niamh Gunn was her name, and she went to the US on a J1 visa. And she a J1 visa, by the way, is this traditional thing. Young Irish university students get these visas. We can go and work for a summer when we're in college in the US, and we typically get jobs in in bars and cafes and chambermaids and all that sort of stuff. We have a lot of fun, and we come home sometimes with some money to pay our college fees. And I did that, and I worked as a chambermaid and a waitress in Bar Harbour in Maine. But this young woman, Niamh Gunn, went and volunteered for the Innocence Project. And she came home, she came back to Ireland afterwards. She couldn't let go of the case she'd been working, so she kept working it. And she tracked down a detective who pointed her to some evidence that had been hidden from the defense in this case. And so as a result of her work, this man was freed from prison. Now, I found that incredibly inspiring, but I didn't really see a story there for me until I kind of came back to the story a couple of years later, and I did a bit more research. And it turned out that even after Niamh found this evidence, it took another 5 years for the case to be heard. By the time that man got out of prison, he had been in prison for, I think, 22 years. He had 3 years left to run his original sentence. And I just thought, wow, it's a much darker and it's a more complicated and sadder story. And I wondered why we had gotten the sanitized, happy version in the original newspaper articles. And I started thinking, is that because the editor thought it was a cleaner view, or maybe the Innocence Project has a sophisticated PR team who are putting the story out? I have no reason to think that, by the way. It was just a thought that crossed my mind. And then I thought, well, if they had, would you blame them? Because they're trying to do impossible work in a world that is so noisy, it doesn't hear anything anymore. And if you were trying so hard to make a difference, would you take one tiny step off the perfectly righteous path to achieve something real? And if you took that step, then would you take another step and then another step? And if you did that, where would you end up? And that for me was the interesting thing as a writer, to try and follow that path and see where it brought me.
That's very interesting. The traditional police procedural crime novel has expanded recently, I think, to include all types of sleuths. We've got podcasters now, journalists, private investigators we've had for a while. By focusing on academics and law students, are you further expanding this group of crime sleuths, do you think?
Why not? I think this is great. I love the idea of, as just a concept, I like the idea of these young college students who are so smart and so bright and so capable, but have not yet been tested in the real world so much, going out and learning the hard way, the realities of the world and what you have to do to actually, the practical things that are hard to do that you need to be able to do to make a difference. I'm going to give you a really stupid example. This is very minor, small thing, but when I had my law practice in Ireland, my younger sister came to work with me for a little while when she was still in university, and I used to make her make all these horrible phone calls. I used to say, Avine, call such and such and ask for such and such, and she would come back and go, oh my God, they said this, what do I say now? And then I would make her go back and do it again. And she got really good at that sort of thing. And she was training to be a doctor, and when she went to work in the hospital, she said to me afterwards, it made such a difference to her ability to advocate for her patients, because a big part of her job was arranging for blood tests or scans or whatever appointment. And it's hard to do that in the hospital. There's a lot of competition for that time. So the fact that she was able to get on the phone, make those difficult calls and push hard and get to a result actually made a difference for her patients. And it's the same thing in law, and it's the same thing in investigating. Sometimes it's just that doggedness that makes a difference.
That's so interesting. I'm just going to say quickly to our audience, we've got another 20 minutes, 25 minutes to go, but this is the time for you to start popping your questions for Dervla into the question and answer facility. So we've got Dervla all to ourselves. She's going to be jetting off to the US pretty soon. So anything that you've been burning to find out, please add it to the Q&A now. Dervla, I'm interested that you've been writing stories for the audiobook company Audible. Can you tell me about this, how this came about?
Yeah, I guess I'm just trying to think, how did it start? The Ruin did very well in the US on Audible. It was in the top 10 for about a month, I think. And that was pretty exciting. I have a wonderful narrator for the books, Aoife McMahon, who narrated The Ruin, The Scholar, and The Good Turn. And people have just fallen in love with her storytelling ability. She's just very, very good at what she does. And so I think that really helped. The books did very well. And then Audible just got in touch and said, would I consider writing an audio exclusive, a novella? And so I wrote The Sisters, and they chose that as their members' choice. And so it was #1 in the US for a month and stayed in the top 10 for a while after, which was very exciting. And so then they just came and said, would I consider signing a contract for a few more? So I actually really enjoy writing the novellas. I think it started to become a thing where in between a novel, it's like just a kind of a palate cleanser or a change of pace. And I feel like I can play with it a little bit more. And there's something about writing for Audible too that changes, because it's going to be performed. The narrators will bring their performance and they'll add another layer onto what you've written. And that's kind of fun too, as a writer, to think about that.
Does it change your style, do you think, when you're writing for ears rather than eyes? Does it change dialogue? Does it change description?
It does a little bit. I always read, for my full-length novels, I always read them out loud anyway at a certain point in the edit, because that rhythm is really important to me, that it feels right. And I think that's important anyway. But when I know I'm writing for Audible, it does change just some practical stuff. I put in way fewer attributions, so there's much less he said, she said, because it's evident from how the narrator's reading it. None of us would ever, as a writer, say, shut up, he said grumpily. That would be ridiculous, right? But there are more subtle versions of that. Obviously in that situation, you don't need the grumpily because he's just said shut up. But there are more subtle versions of that in writing that you can consider when you're writing for audio, that you don't need to use, and you can look for opportunities. So sometimes in the writing, I might put in some parentheses, so there's some additional information for the narrator that I would otherwise have had to find a way to work into the text to convey the emotion, or convey, exactly what the characters are feeling or trying to communicate. But I can leave it to the narrator in certain circumstances, as long as I let them know that's what I'm thinking. I don't want to overdo that, because the narrator is interpreting the story their own way and telling the story, and you need to leave people space to do that themselves. But occasionally I will write in parentheses, this is what I'm thinking at this point.
And just a very sort of technical publishing question. So who edits the books that you write for Audible? Do you have a publisher and an editor, as you would with a traditional?
Audible have editors in-house. So it would be an in-house Audible editor that I would work with on those stories.
Interesting. When we were speaking before, at least when we were communicating before, you told me you had some very exciting new news about the murder rule. Would you like to tell us?
Yes. Fun news. The Murder Rule is going to be made into a limited series, a major TV series in the US, by a company called FX, which we're less familiar with in Australia. But in the US, it's a major cable channel. It goes into about 90 million households, which I think is virtually everybody that has cable in the US. And they make really premium dramas like The Americans and Nip Tuck and shows like that. So I was very excited when I heard they were interested in doing the Murder Rule.
So what happens next? Is there a timeline, or do you just wait?
I'm told it's going into production this year. There are writers already in place. I've seen emails from, with notes from the writers and different things that have gone back and forth. So it seems to be moving ahead really fast, which is super exciting.
So that means that we could see it, the US could see it on screen next year.
Maybe. We'll see. I mean, I guess there's so many things that can happen between now and then. And I don't have a specific timeline yet, but I can say that it's looking really good and it's looking like it's all taking off. So it's very exciting.
And is that something that you'll be involved in as a writer or as a consultant, or do you know that yet?
Well, I'm not a writer on it, but I have been able to contribute some background stuff. So I've been able to send off my my detailed character descriptions that I always do, that they're not part of the book, but they form the background to the book, and other background work that I had previously done, but also some thoughts about the themes and the direction and why I wrote certain things and why certain things matter and what's super important to me about the book. But I've also been able to read, the writer's takes, the screenwriter's takes, and that's been fascinating because they have a slightly different, like most of it we're actually very similar, but there are a couple of areas where they see more potential or interesting angles, and I just find that fascinating to see another writer's brain come to something I've written.
So a real collaboration then.
Yeah, it's exciting.
You're part of an agency called the Story Factory. What is that?
The Story Factory, gosh, that's a good question. Well, Shane Salerno is my agent, and Shane is in the LA, lives in LA, and he represents some major writers like Don Winslow and Jan Jovanovic and Adrian McKinty and others. And Shane is just a really uber agent. He works very hard for his clients, and he's very involved. Shane was a screenwriter himself for many years, and still is a screenwriter. Has written some very major movies and continues to do so. But he's, I guess, because he has a writer's background, he thinks a bit like a writer. But he's also very tightly connected to the movie industry in the US, which opens other opportunities for his writers, I guess.
And how would you describe the relationship between an agent and an author, in your case with Shane Salerno? For people who don't have that relationship, what is it? Is it mentor? Is it colleague?
Yeah, I guess it depends entirely on the writer and the agent. I mean, I know that Shane and Don Winslow, for example, are very close friends and have been for many years, and they speak to each other daily, Shane and I speak very regularly. I absolutely trust his judgment. I talk to him about any story, book or story I want to write. I would talk to him about it first and get his view. So yeah, I mean, we work really closely together, and it's so important when you have an agent that you feel that they really believe in you and your writing, because it isn't always like that. Sometimes it's a bit more compromised than that. And I never have any doubt that Shane absolutely believes in my writing, and that's a really good place to be. I trust his judgment. So I'm really lucky, very lucky. Very few people have that kind of situation.
While you're in the middle of writing, do you read at the same time, or do you have a hiatus while you're writing?
I do usually read, actually. And I know a lot of writers don't, because they're concerned that the voice of another writer will come in while they're trying to create something new. But I find it pretty inspiring. And I'm like a magpie. I steal little bits, it's like, I'm always fascinated by how an author has achieved something. And if a book has blown me away, I'm going to go back and read it a second time and try and figure out exactly how they did it. And there's no question that the style of a writer I've fallen in love with in that moment will bleed into my book for a little while. Like if I've just read an Anthony Horowitz, you'll feel a bit of Anthony Horowitz for a chapter or two, but all that smooths out because I do so many drafts. It's like that just goes away. It's just inspiration. It doesn't last. It doesn't stick in the book. And at the end of the day, the book has one voice. So I'm not really worried about it. And I would hate to. I'm always writing. So if I stopped reading when I was writing, I'd never read.
And so what are you reading at the moment, or what's most taken you recently?
Oh, wow. The book I enjoyed most recently, actually, I've got it sitting on my desk, even though it's not, this is not the cover, sadly. So I'm not showing you the right cover. This was an ARC I got, but it's Larry Gentle's The Woman in the Library. Oh, it's such a fun read, particularly if you're a real reader. It's set in, at the beginning, you've got these people sitting in Boston Public Library just doing their work and their various bits and pieces. And there's a woman screams, and there's a little bit of an investigation, but nothing seems to have happened. And then ultimately it turns out there was a murder. And these strangers kind of form a sort of a loose alliance and start a quasi-investigation, kind of. So that's happening. And then at the same time, there's this sub-story where we have correspondence, this little conceit. We've got correspondence between the author of the main story and this person who is sort of trying to advise her, give her, research help. And that's just very funny and clever in itself. There's like a subplot running through that. But the whole book is really smart and self-aware, and it's got this sharp sense of humor. It's just a treat. It is just a treat. So if you see it out there, guys, grab it. You're really going to enjoy it.
Fantastic. And you've got the arc of it, so the advanced reading copy, but I've seen the final copy, and it's the final cover, and it's fantastic.
It
It's
is great cover.
Shocky and bright.
Yeah.
And Solari Gentile, of course, is a great friend of Bad Sydney Crime Writers Festival. So so delighted to have that recommendation from you, Dervla. We're getting to the time for questions, and we have a series of questions that have come through. So I'm just going to start asking you a couple of questions. The first one is from Bear Carroll, who's a writer herself. Dervla, you write wonderfully atmospheric books. How have you achieved such a strong sense of place in both Ireland and now Virginia while writing from Perth, which is such a very different place?
Oh, that's a great question. That's such a funny one. In the early days with the Ruin, I had a little office just outside the kitchen, and this is the honest truth, and it's so cheesy. I used to be, well, the kids were always coming and going anyway, for starters, which started it. I used to wear headphones, and I would play, white noise. And what I liked to play most was the sound of rain and the fire crackling in the background. And then I would it's terrible for the environment, but I would turn the air conditioning up and put on a jumper. I'd sit there in the cold, listening to my rain sounds and think about Ireland. And I think there was something too about being so far away from Galway that really kind of makes the things that make Galway itself stand out more in your memory. The contrast between Galway and Perth is so dramatic that it made the things that were really specific to Galway stand out more clearly in my mind in a way that I don't think they would have if I'd just been there and been writing from there. So that really helped. And then taking that experience forward into writing in the US, I spent a summer working in Bar Harbor. The book is set in Virginia and Bar Harbor. I spent a summer working in Bar Harbor when I was very young. And those memories are particularly bright in my mind and strong memories. So it was good to look back on those and sort of write from that point of view. And in any case, that part of the book is very heightened, intentionally. It's almost notebook-esque in its kind of romance. So I was painting it with the brightest colors I could. And then Virginia, I only got to spend less than a week there and that was pre-COVID. I couldn't go back because we couldn't travel, which was a real pity. So I had to work off just the memories of that short visit and then, photographs and videos and everything online. But I tried very hard to create the feel of the place.
Deb asks these two questions. First of all, how long did The Ruin take you to write? And how has your process changed through your confidence and experience?
Oh, thanks, Deb, for that one. The Ruin, I know for sure I started writing seriously in 2014 because I was saying, okay, I was actually thinking about doing an MBA, believe it or not, because I wasn't particularly enjoying my, the work I was doing at that point. And so I was seriously considering an MBA, which would have been 5 years part-time. And I thought, what the hell am I doing? Spending 5 years part-time in something I don't want to do. So I said, right, I'm going to give 5 years to writing. I'll start writing at night. I'll do it very seriously, the same way I would with anything else, and we'll see where we go. So I know I had that kind of decision. I took that decision in 2014, and I signed my contract with Harper, certainly in October 2016, and the book went up, I started sending it out around July. So I can't tell you exactly how long it took to write because I wasn't writing very steadily. And in the early days, I would get maybe 250 words a writing session and then I'd delete it and start again. And I wrote 30,000 words at one point and scrapped that. So it's hard to point to it. But if I was being like, I guess a year and a half maybe for the first book, probably a lot faster now, I certainly write a first draft in 3 months, maybe 4 months, but it will take me a long time to polish it. I do a lot of drafts. If anything has changed in my process now, I have a process. I had no process in the early days, just a blank page and idea. But now I have a process that I follow relatively consistently, where I work up the characters first in a very detailed way, and then I move on and I work. I start sketching out the scenes I think would be the most fun to write. Once I have 7 to 10 of those about, I'll go back and start doing other things. It's actually a version of Elizabeth George's process, which she outlines in great detail in a book called Right Away. And I read that the first time and thought, oh my God, Elizabeth, you're cracked. This is far too difficult and it's much too much like hard work and all the rest of it. But actually, it's hugely helpful when you're trying to build a book and you're on a deadline and you're trying to, get your creativity moving. So I do a lot of that process now.
Dervla, this is a question from Ron Dick, and this is his question. Do you feel your law studies and career changed you and that you had more zest and self-reliance as a result, more courage to step out and write stories with message to change the world compared with perhaps the situation would be if you hadn't undertaken law?
Oh, Ron, that's a really good question. I think it changed me in the way in terms of self-reliance. Yes, I really do. Because the thing about being a lawyer that is not common to every profession is that you must have an answer. It's not enough to say to your client, well, I think, or it could go either way, or it could be this, or it could be that. They're not paying you for that. They need you to get them an answer. Yes, when it comes to like litigation, you can never give a guarantee. But when it comes to a point of law, you must know the answer. Or when it comes to even transactional law, you have to get your client from A to Z. They don't want to know about the hard things you encountered along the way because they're paying your fee and they want to get the result that they're paying for. And some of those things are really difficult to do. And you can encounter all sorts of challenges and all sorts of obstacles, and you do become self-reliant. And there's a degree of confidence that comes from that when you have a win and another win, and that doggedness, I think, and that self-discipline. So I think as a writer, you must be self-disciplined. You have to be able to rely on yourself, and you have to have a sort of confidence that you'll get there, even if it's really uncomfortable in the moment. And I think those are the things we have in common with lawyers, perhaps. What do you think, Suzanne? Because you're a similar situation.
No, I think discipline. A lot of my work now is writing decisions because I preside over a courtroom rather than representing people. And I think getting things done. I think when I started out very early, I was trying to write these beautiful, beautiful decisions. And my mentor said, you know what, you're never going to get anything done if you keep going like that. So I think, and sometimes you don't want to write them.
Yeah.
And sometimes I don't want to write a novel, but I turn up. And I think partly that legal experience is that you turn up to do things that are hard, and writing is hard, but you turn up.
Yeah. 100%.
The next question we've got is actually a comment, a very interesting comment, and it's from Judy Hawkins. And this is what she says. I think it's a she, or it could be Jude E. Hawkins. I'm an Audible addict. I'm 83 and the print hard copy book is too small to read. I honestly feel that audiobooks are a sign of the future. Some are very reasonably priced and I can keep the books. Also available to borrow in some libraries. Awesome service.
That's lovely to hear. I agree. I mean, look, I really enjoy the audiobooks I listen to. And the one thing I've learned about audiobooks is that I enjoy certain books in audio that I'm not that pushed about in paperback, and vice versa. It has actually broadened my reading rather than narrowed it or shifted it. I listen to a wider range of books than I would read. And there's certain books I'll choose in paperback and certain books only in audio. So it's a funny old thing.
And it makes everything interesting. It makes washing interesting. It makes cooking interesting.
Exactly.
It makes just looking out the window interesting because someone's telling you a story.
Yeah, you're far more inclined to walk the dogs if you have a story in your ears.
Exactly. I very much agree with Judy Hawkins. Now we have two more questions, which are similar ones, but I'm going to start with Tracy Nunziato. And her question is this: is The Good Turn the end of Cormac Riley? Dervla?
Oh, Tracy, I don't know is the answer to that. Is that a terrible thing to say? I don't know. I don't have a story for him right now in my mind, but that's not to say there won't be one in the future. I think when I got to the end of The Good Turn, I felt like if I came back to him, he would need to be in a different place in his life. Which would mean moving forward by at least a few years to see what had changed, so that things have happened to him that we haven't seen happen. So I've got more background to explore and lean into. And I just want some time to go by in my real life too, to mature myself and change a little bit, and then have other things I can bring to that story again. think if I had written another Cormac Riley straight after The Good Turn, I would have been giving you sort of the same story in a slightly different guise. And I didn't really want to do that. I wanted to give it space. So I always intended to go back. Right now, though, the next story I have in my head is a different one. But so I can't say yes and I can't say no. I think probably I will come back, but I haven't got a specific plan in mind right now.
We have a question from Greg Woodland, which is in fact the same question about Cormac Riley, but we also have a comment. Now, Greg Woodland is a friend of a Bad Sydney Crime Writers Festival. He's a crime writer himself, having published The Night Whistler 2 years ago, with its sequel coming out later this year. And Greg's also a good friend of Thursday Book Club. And Greg says this, Dervla, congratulations on The Murder Rule, which I can't wait to read or see next year. He's a big fan of the Cormac Riley trilogy, and he's also keen to know when we might see Cormac again.
Oh gosh, Greg, it's so nice that people care about Cormac. I love that people are really interested. And now you're all making me, it's funny because I am being asked about this question a lot and I'm having to think about it to really answer it. And earlier on, I was writing an answer to this question in a Q&A and I started to think of places I could bring him and things I could do with him. And it started to spark that kind of story muscle a little bit. So keep asking and it might be more likely to happen. That's all I can say.
Well, I think on that interesting note, whereby we may or may not get another Cormac in the near future, I'm going to thank you so much, Dervla, for your time today and hand us both over to Catherine.
Well, thank you so much to both of you. Great conversation. I've got all these thoughts in my head, the one about lawyers writing crime and what drives them and what particular aspects their background helps. And the idea that innocent people aren't always nice. And I suppose the corollary is guilty people aren't always horrible either, which I think we know already. And I am so glad to hear that I'm not the only one who's in love with Cormac. And the idea of him coming back at a later stage is really interesting, a different person. Makes me think a bit about Val McDermid's books, which are going to be set every 10 years in a particular person's life. And the second one is coming out this year, actually. And so, something's been happening to this journalist for the last 10 years, and we don't know, we won't know everything. Yeah. But it's the same person, which is a fascinating thing to do. And I completely agree, Dervla, about audio versus paper. I listen to things that I know I would be too lazy to read, that I'd skip. And I'd go, oh yeah, there's not enough action, I'm bored. Yeah. Which is, it shows what a superficial person I am. But when you listen to something, you could, you stay in the car and you just won't leave. I'm having to control that aspect. In fact, I had to say, I take a long route home today when I was listening to one of your books, thinking, I've got another few minutes. I want to know what happens next. So thank you so much. And thank you very, very much, Suzanne. And if you haven't yet got your copy of The Murder Rule, jump online, go to Booktopia and buy it now. And in fact, if you haven't fallen in love with Cormac, this is your chance. Go back to the beginning as well. Too much is never enough in some cases. Look, we usually have monthly events. We're not having an event next month because June is going to be a fantastic 5-week International Crime Writers Online Festival. And we've got some great, great people. We've got Harlan Coben with his new book. We've got Janet Ivanovic starting a whole new series. And it's bound to be funny and sassy and full of romance and that kind of thing. Mick Herron, a wonderful British writer with Bad Actors, the latest in his Slow Horses trilogy. Adrian McKinty, who also lived in Australia and is also Irish, but now lives in America. With The Island, a standalone book, which I've just finished reading. And talk about nail biting. And then the fabulous Don Winslow with City on Fire, the beginning of another series. In fact, this is a trilogy we already know. And it's wonderful. Again, I've just started that one. I haven't got that far. So I hope you'll all come to see that. It'll be on our website from tomorrow. So jump in, and first of all, we're going to have a special offer of a pass for the whole festival. So just buy those because, It's like you're gonna be there. You know, you're all gonna be there. Also, just to tell you, if you want to find out more about BAD, join up to our mailing list. Just go onto the website and get our mailing list. We have a fantastic podcast. Suzanne is one of the hosts, and find that wherever you get your podcasts. We've got a one that should be released, I think, very soon, isn't it, Suzanne, about Jane Cara and Deborah Oswald talking about what you might do, how far you might go to save a life. And it's really, really excellent. Both those books are fantastic. So look, I'm sure you have all enjoyed the evening as much as I have. Thank you for joining us. And thank you again to Suzanne and to Dervla. Have a great trip, Dervla. We might try and come and see you in Sydney when you're here. If you can creep in. And thank you to all the BAD community, and see you all again in June. Bye for now.
Thank you for having me.
Not at all.